Morning everybody, I'm Kurt Vandaele. I'm a researcher at the European Trade Union Institute based in Brussels. In June I published this working paper, so my presentation will be basically a summary of this working paper. In my working paper I give a selective overview of some recent examples of associational forms for representing workers in the platform economy in Western Europe. The focus is on the context, how the context is, or in this case the dynamics in the platform economy is shaping the representation and voice of digital platform workers. I make two claims in this working paper. One is, I think, at least from a European or Western European perspective, the future of unionism looks less bleak. Platform economy is an opportunity for unions to experiment with organizational forms of collective representation and to see whether there could be combinations or coexistence of different forms of representation. And the second claim I make is that there's a more pronounced or more prevalent demarcation between the two logics, the logic of membership and the logic of influence within the unions, and this is more exposed within the platform economy. So what I think is what digital labor platforms are is a kind of matching supply and demands within the labor market, and this is based on algorithmic management, and this management is transforming the work organization. Algorithmic management is extracting, analyzing, and using data as a raw material. And this is new about it, but I think in terms of the work organization, you see that this is not so new. You can have several examples of this. Division of labor into small jobs, that's new. Home-based production or on-demand work, this is not new. You find this in the 19th century. Piecework compensation or the intermediate-based business model, you find examples of this all within capitalism of the 19th century. Platform work is instead being part of the recommodification of labor and partly dependent on the growth of contingent forms of work, because mostly if people do platform work, it's to top up their income, at least in Europe. The main issue within the platform economy, as I think, is the vagueness of the employment relationships, and this opens room to exploitation. And you see that there's an absence currently of regulatory institutions or institutional security, so platform workers have no or a very weak institutional power. What could be other sources of power? And now I'm basing myself on the work of, for instance, Beverly Silver. If you look at the structural power of platform workers, and if you compare this, there are two forms of structural power. Workplace bargaining power. This is based on your strategic position within the distribution or production network, so it's more based on luck. For instance, air traffic controls has a lot of workplace bargaining power. A second form of structural power is marketplace bargaining power. This is based on skills and on employment. And if you look at the main two types of platform work, online crowd work and offline on-demand work. Within the online crowd work, there's a division between microtasks and macrotasks. And here that you see that workplace bargaining power is very low. I'll explain this in the next slides. And also marketplace bargaining power is also low. If you look at the offline on-demand work, I think there is one exception, and this is the transport sector, where traditionally within the transport sectors, workers have some workplace bargaining power. And you see that here as well in the on-demand work. If you look at the general on-demand work, some of those workers have rather low to intermediate marketplace bargaining power based on their skill level. Our platform workers willing to use their structural power, I think it much will depend on their labor market attachment. If it's your main source of income, then I think you will be more likely to use your structural power. So a bit more in detail, the online micro crowd work is low skilled and low paid. It's repetitive micro tasks or click work like data entry, content tagging or interpretation or finding information. It's part of this trend of offshore outsourcing. Do those works have disruptive capacity? Well, I think work stoppers will likely hardly affect the value chains, and there are hardly any spatial constraints for the platforms. This could be nuanced a little bit because it's also depends on the internet penetration, where those workers work, on the language and other skills, and on the labor costs. If you look at the associational power of those workers, you see some proliferation of the global unit federations like Uni Global, together with other stakeholders like the International Labour Organization. You find some kinds of self-organization of those workers via online communities for discussion, work and sharing information. And you might think there might be rising epistemic communities, some activists or engaged academics that are also trying to help those workers, like for instance the Fair Work Foundation for certifying bona fide platforms. The online micro crowd work, this type of work requires professional knowledge and competences like graphic design work, web and software development, editing and translation work. I think if you look at Europe and the core countries of capitalism, it's more or less similar to agency work, and it means for those workers in Europe another market they can explore. If you look outside the core of the capitalist countries, in like for instance in the global south, I think those workers can make use of skill arbitrage, meaning that they will be paid more by the platforms than within their local market. However, there are some constraints. For instance, if there's again the fierce competition induced by the platforms, and also the client-operated digital management methods using online individual ranking and reputation systems. Their associational power, if you look at them, maybe they can make use of labor market intermediaries who could act as quasi-unions, if in the case that if they are mutualized by users or workers, not the labor market intermediaries working or private labor market intermediaries. This is an exception. You could also think that they can set up their own platform cooperatives, and at the same time mainstream unions could also helpful here. They have some historical experience in organizing freelancers, and I think here the problem is a bit how unions with this historical experience could transpose this to unions who are working in those platform sectors. I think the main question is here for those freelance workers if they have an appetite for collective representation, and I think this is maybe based on their occupational identity, if you feel like a worker or not. So if you feel like a worker, then you might join a union, and similarly, if you have left-wing political orientations, you might be more likely to join a union. If you look at associational power, there's also some successes via the, for instance, initiative set up by IG Metall in Germany, the crowdsourcing code of conduct set up by German unions and also with all the unions from Sweden, for instance. Also for setting some minimum standards within that sector. Difficulties within that sector is the antitrust and competition regulation, but this could be adopted. More difficult, I think, is that the platforms consider themselves as a tech success, some neutral organization, and there's also some general ignorance, unwillingness, or resistance by the platforms to engage with unions or other forms of collective organization. A third type is the on-demand digital platform workers in the private sectors. In private settings, it's time and place depending services in private sectors like repair work, or domestic services like cleaning, child or elderly care. Marketplace bargaining power depend on the skill level of those workers, but also they have some client loyalty, and they also the online ranking and reputation systems that hinders their use of making collective action, for instance. Here you see the associational power can be done via mainstream unions, but also via some grassroots unions. There's the example of the IWGB and the UK that is also trying to organize cleaners, for instance, also via those cleaners that are employed via the platforms. You could also think that those workers could set up their platform corporations, and also labor market intermediaries could play a role here. Unions have some success here. There's the example of one collective agreement. In Denmark, the Danish union call it the first collective agreement within the platform economy, but Swedish colleagues are not that happy with this promotion. So the Swedish ones think they have a first collective agreement with the platform, digital labor platform. I think the main thing here is that of this collective agreement that unions, it's a collective agreement within the cleaning sector. So, and the main thing here is that those mainstream unions could enhance trust between the client and the cleaner. A fourth type of platform work is within the public space. So delivery and, for instance, especially delivery and the transport sector. Those workers have some disruptive capacity in local markets by combining online campaigning and direct grassroots small-scale protests in cities. There's still some strikes going on, for instance, in France, but you have also seen strikes in the UK, Italy, Belgium, and also other protests in Switzerland and Germany, for instance. And now you see this strike movement is spreading to the low-wage, non-platform sector, recently via the max strike. So those platform workers are combining forces with other low-wage workers within the fast food sector. If you look at their associational power, I think very prevalent is that they are organizing by grassroots unions, like in the UK, but also, for instance, in Sweden. Those workers have also set up their own organizations. I call it city-based guilds. This is based on mass self-communication networks and also physical co-presence and geographical proximity. They are working in large cities. You might think they can move to app-based worker-led platform groups. They are thinking about this. Yesterday and today there was a meeting of those platform workers from Spain and Italy, Belgium, the UK, and Germany, and some Nordic countries. And they had a 2 days meeting. So this might be one of the outcomes, and also mainstream unions are involved in this, and they were also present at this meeting. But there might be some tensions between those mainstream unions and those self-organizations of platform workers, especially in the case of Italy. If you look at the Belgium situation, then also labor market intermediaries have played a role in representing those food couriers, for instance. You might think that there might also be some alliance building between mainstream and grassroots unions. For instance, they have some test cases in court about the employment relation, and also those self-organizations are making use of the public, for instance, for crowdfunding, their strike fund, or for litigations actions. They are also making use of discursive power. because those platforms like Foodora and Deliveroo are sensible to their reputation. So this could be a potential for rulemaking and institutional power in the future. So far we have seen some success in the case of Italy and Bologna with the charter between some of the local platforms, not the international ones. Maybe this is important to mention. Also in the Danish case, the collective agreement is between a Danish union and a local platform. And another success was, for instance, the setup of a works council in Austria. So at the very end I come to this figure. In this figure you don't see the micro crowd work, because in my case from a European perspective it was not so important. But you see here the macro crowd work and the on-demand work, and then the logic of membership, meaning that unions or the collective organizations are more focused on the interests and needs of their members. And then at the other end you see the logic of influence, whereby unions or collective organizations are more focused on their exchange with the employers and the state, for instance. So what you see is that within macro crowd work and logic of membership, you might think that worker-led platforms, cooperatives could arise there. If you look at the logic of membership and on-demand work, also again platform cooperatives could arise there. You've seen the rise of the proliferation of grassroots unions and also the rise of guilds and self-organization. And then if you look at the logic of influence, there you see the presence of long-standing unions, mainstream unions, labor market intermediaries, and as quasi-unions. So either they could work together. I think there's a lot to be said to work together, but there's still some tensions. But I think at the end there's a platform world to win. Thank you.
Thank you very much.